The link to the Chandra site, I think you'll find it in your show notes. When you go there, you can read a text version, you can listen to the text version being read in a human voice, and there are sonifications as well.
Please welcome Christine Malec.
The Luminato Festival Toronto runs from June 9th through June 19th. And on every day, there's in-person events, there's things going on in the city, and all of those have accessibility in mind, so physical features as well as audio description where appropriate. But also what's going on is this digital platform of online radio, which is available all around the world. And it's 6 or so hours a day of a mixture of amazing stuff.
Co-host of the Talk Description to Me podcast and consultant to the Chandra X-Ray Observatory and accessibility consultant and reporter for the Luminato Festival Toronto.
Yeah, it's called Talk Description to Me. The website is talkdescriptiontome.com.
And now, here's Christine Malec. We hope you enjoy.
I love this idea of blind culture. It's something I've been thinking a lot about and working with and talking with people about.
Welcome to Blind Abilities. I'm Jeff Thompson. I'm excited to have returning to the Blind Abilities studio, Christine Malec. Christine, how you doing?
I'm doing great, thanks. How are you?
I'm doing great, thank you. And some of you may recognize Christine's voice from the Talk Description to Me podcast with JJ Hunt. How's that going?
It's going great. We just released episode 106, which is kind of mind-mangling to think that we've been doing this that long. We just had kind of a landmark episode that was much beloved by some and completely indifferent to others, but we covered Star Wars, and so that was really fun for me. I'm a total science geek, science fiction nerd, so anytime we cover science or science fiction, I get pretty excited. So we did a Star Trek episode a few months ago where we talked about the different series, the different looks, the different visuals, some of the aliens, and there was a lot of popular demand for us to do that for Star Wars, which is arguably much richer visual landscape. So it's a two-parter actually, because what we did a couple of weeks ago was mostly the movies, the 3 sets of trilogies. So we talked about some of the cinematography, some of the ways the aliens look, and we actually had done another episode just on robots. And so we covered R2-D2 and C-3PO in a different episode. So there's lots of sciencey geek stuff in there. And then there's a new Obi-Wan series coming out soonish. And we're going to do a part 2 based on the visuals of that. There's so much to talk about. We had a listener request for the new Star Trek Strange New Worlds, which I'm totally in love with. That's just completely captivated me. So I'm hoping that we can do an episode on the visuals of that. In the Star Wars, we didn't even get to spaceships in the Star Wars. And so I'm advocating for a whole episode on spaceships, not just Star Wars, but, go back to the 50s and what were science fiction iterations of spaceships and flying saucers, and take that through all the different variations on science fiction to what spaceships look like in Star Wars or Star Trek, or the new iterations like The Expanse, or there's just so much to cover. There's just so much to talk about.
And you both do it so well. And now that we're in the stars, we might as well talk about the Chandra X-Ray Observatory.
Yes.
I guess there's a big black hole out there somewhere.
There is a big black hole. Recently, my job, whatever it is lately, is my dream job, because JJ and I also, one of the things we do is describing the images that the Chandra X-Ray Observatory releases. So the Chandra Observatory is observing the galaxy in non-visual wavelengths. And so the stuff they get back are like X-rays and radio waves and things that I barely understand, but they're not actually visual. You can't see them with your eye. And so what Chandra does is they make these images. They take the data and they make visualizations to help sighted people understand the phenomenon. So these are pretty complex. There's lots of science involved and there's lots of visual details. So what JJ and I do is describe. So it's mostly JJ. He writes the stuff, but because it's such a unique form of description, he likes to have a consultant, that's me, to read through it and see if it makes sense. Because in this kind of writing, you have to kind of integrate description with the science. So not only is it describing, it's explaining at the same time. And that's a pretty unconventional way to do it. So we've been doing this for about 18 months now, and it's quite well received, but the big excitement, as some of you may know, on May 11th or 12th, 2022, some images were released that were collected from various sources, Chandra and other arrays as well, that gave the first evidence of what people was pretty sure was there, which is the black hole at the center of our galaxy. So theory had predicted this, but there had been no evidence until this release in May. And so when Chandra released the images, they're very conscientious. They want the descriptions available at the same time. The descriptions get released at the same time as the images. So I felt very, very excited. I got to, read the copy a day or two before. It was very exciting. So on the same day that the images were released, JJ's description of those images was also released, and there's sonifications as well, which we're not part of creating, but so these are, instead of a visualization or a written description, this is sound. And so the data is taken and sort of massaged and played around with by an astrophysicist / musician, he's both, and puts them into a sound format as well. And those are hugely popular because not only are they useful for blind and low vision people, but neurodivergent people, people who like to experience different sensory inputs. The link to the Chandra site, I think you'll find it in your show notes, because when you go there, you can read a text version, you can listen to the text version being read in a human voice, and there are sonifications as well. So there's so much going on with accessibility around astronomy that makes me very excited. And so there's no confirmation of this yet, but there's very strong movement that the James Webb Telescope, which is just setting itself up, the Lagrange point now, it's not sending back images yet, but there's very strong movement to make sure that those images get described in the same way that the Chandra images get described once they start coming back. So there's a huge movement towards accessibility in NASA and in space agencies, and it's so exciting to me. Even if I wasn't involved with the work, I would be really excited to see this stuff happening, but I feel so privileged that I'm getting to participate in a small way in some of this stuff. Very, very exciting if you're a space geek.
And that's really cool. I mean, if you ever see, get notice that the end of the universe is coming the day before we get the information, could you give us a spoiler alert? But no, that's true. No one's ever seen it before. There's never been proof of it. And you guys get it. And you make it audio described day one.
Yeah.
That's great.
Yeah. And I get so excited to think about kids growing up who are blind and low vision now, because when I was a kid, STEM fields just didn't seem like an option to me. I never thought seriously about it. And part of the reason was there was no materials accessible. And just last night, I was looking at some tactile diagrams that NASA from satellites and stuff, and they were like the Earth relative to the moon and scaled to size and distance. And there was some satellite images of the Earth that were tactile. And I thought, my gosh, this stuff is stuff that I figured out how to understand as an adult. But what if I had had access to this stuff as a kid who was blind? And so I'm really optimistic that it will encourage more blind and low vision people to enter the STEM fields and not feel intimidated by that stuff.
But here you are today. You're doing a great service to everyone that wants that description, wants those images described to them. And those kids are listening to your proofreading and your consulting with JJ. So good for you. Good for you.
Yeah. I like to say irreverently, there's never been a better time to be blind. And part of the reason is that there is such a movement now, especially in the last 2 years, towards accessibility and inclusion in all fields. So science, but also in the arts. And I'm seeing this in a lot of different organizations. So another part of my work is consulting with different arts organizations on how to make their content accessible. So during the pandemic, that might have meant a listening party where the play is audio described. And in the real world, it might be, once we have audio description, how can we make the theater experience even more accessible? So things like the theater might have a staff or a volunteer who is ready to meet you at the local transit stop or come out and find you in your Uber or your Wheel-Trans, whatever vehicle, however you've got there, so that sometimes it's the last 50 feet. You know, you might be able to navigate the transit or get to the venue, but then what? And so agencies are really going even beyond audio description and ramps and things to how can we make the whole experience as seamless as possible, which kind of brings me to the project I'm most involved with at the moment, which is the Luminato Festival in Toronto. And I think maybe, Jeff, did we talk about this in previous years too? I think we did.
Yeah, I think it was June 10th.
Yeah,
during the pandemic. Yeah, last year.
Yeah. So the Luminato Festival Toronto it's been around for many years, and it's this very sweeping, multidisciplinary collection of things that happens in different venues all around the city. So it might be a play, it might be a musical performance, it might be a meditation, it might be an art installation, and they don't shy away from the tough questions of the day. There's lots of art/political content that's meant to be provocative and stimulate conversation. So they actually, even before the pandemic, in the before time, they were kind of jumping ahead of the curve because they really wanted to ramp up their accessibility and inclusion practices. And so they started something called the Access Advisory. And we met in January of 2020, which was, just before things went crazy. And so in the room, there were a couple of visually impaired people, a couple of deaf or hard of hearing people, some people with physical challenges. And the goal was to look at the whole organization, not only what was being presented in the festival, but how it was being presented, who is on staff, how is the art being created, and to look at that with accessibility and inclusion in mind right from the beginning. Kind of like when we talk about websites and, let's not tack on some accessibility thing afterwards. Let's consider accessibility right from the beginning. And so that's what Luminato started out to do, even before it was, trendy as it became more popular in the pandemic to do that. And so we started having early conversations, and where it's landed now is somewhere that for me is really exciting for myself personally and for the blind and low vision community. So the access points for the blind and low vision community is something called Radio Lumi. And what this is it's an audio-only component to the festival. So the festival runs from June 9th through June 19th. And on every day, there's in-person events, there's things going on in the city, and all of those have accessibility in mind, so physical features as well as audio description where appropriate. But also what's going on is this digital platform of online radio, which is available all around the world. And it's 6 or so hours a day of a mixture of amazing stuff. So I'm going to go through who the team is because some of the names will definitely be familiar to some of your listeners. So myself, Christine Malec, JJ Hunt, the audio describer and co-host of Talk Description to Me, audio describer Rebecca Singh, and Ramya Amuthan, who is a co-host of Kelly and Company, which is a audio-only program here hosted by Accessible Media. That's a daily live show. That's a grab bag of stuff for the blind and low vision community. And Tanisha Samuels, who's a new addition this year, who's blind and low vision. So 3 of us are blind, low vision, and then there's 2 audio describers. So that's sort of the team that we start with. And so each day, what you get on Radio Lumi, there'll be 1 or 2 pieces that are centered. So we may get a broadcast of a cabaret, or we might get a broadcast of a play that has audio description, or we might get a broadcast of a public talk where there's an audio describer on site who's filling in some of the visuals of the scene, setting the scene for the talk. And so those are some of the centerpieces each day, but built around that is a lot of added content, like added value content. So there's music from disabled artists, and my personal favorites are the interviews. Like you, I love interviewing, and that's one of the things that I get to do as a co-host. And what's completely awesome about this is it's starting out directed at a blind and low vision audience. Now, my optimistic and completely reasonable hope is that it reaches a wider audience because this material is so great and it's completely relevant to everyone. But the great defining thing here is I'm an interviewer. I get to interview artists and famous people, and I'll get to that in a minute, but I get to interview them as me, as a blind person. It's not like, I worked hard, I got a job at the CBC or the NPR, and now I'm an interviewer. And so I'm interviewing from the perspective of a conventional interviewer. I get to be myself. And so last year, for example, I had the privilege to interview Edward Bertinski, who is a very well-renowned photographer who deals with issues around our impact on the natural world. And when I spoke with him, I was able to say things like, okay, so I'm blind. Photography is a closed book to me. Try to explain to me what makes a perfect photograph. And so we get to have these conversations that are really unique. And so this year, I haven't said this publicly except to friends. So this is a very big moment for me. It's a very pivotal moment in my career. Maybe this won't mean so much to American listeners, but I got to interview David Suzuki. Now, I don't know how many people in the States know who that is, but he is a famous, well-beloved Canadian scientist and environmental activist. And so even that, just to say, I got to interview David Suzuki. That's mind-mangling. That's life-changing for me. And the thing is, I got to do it from a blindness perspective. So I got to ask, I don't experience the world visually. What are your favorite sounds or smells or tactile experiences from the natural world? And so personally and professionally, that moment is just kind of dreamy. Because if I ever imagined myself as an interviewer or a journalist, it was me fitting in where I could in the sighted world and finding a place where I could do the work that journalists and interviewers do. But where I find myself now, because of the sort of social landscape that we're in, is I can actually do that work from my own perspective as a blind person, and so that other members of the blind and low vision community get to hear ourselves represented in an interview context where you're talking to high profile people and they answer questions that you might have as a blind or low vision person.
I think that's awesome because let me just say, 20 years ago, I remember someone saying there's no blind culture. And I was saying, I think there is. I've witnessed it. I've come from the sighted world and now I'm in this world. There is blind culture. And by you doing that, that feeds us information how we perceive it. It's actually geared towards the blind and visually impaired. I really like that.
I love this idea of blind culture. It's something I've been thinking a lot about and working with and talking with people about. And we may not get too far with this point, but one of the things that got me started thinking about that was a sighted friend said to me, what is blind humor? What are jokes that the blind community would find funny and other people just wouldn't get? And that was really provocative question. That sent me just for weeks and weeks and weeks. That sent me off thinking about that. So yeah, the idea of blind culture is something that I thought a lot about and dissected. And I'm curious, can you identify things from your experience that you would say are blind culture related? Or is that too loaded?
I think the way we communicate amongst each other, we interact without even batting an eye at it and not thinking about the sighted world in a sense, it becomes a norm. Mm-hmm. Something that I don't think you can really put a pulse on it. It's just the acceptance that we exist and we communicate together. And when we step out into the other world, when you're 30 feet away from the door and there's people around you, you're in their culture. You're in that's that world, Yeah. But if you have IRA, and if you're talking to an IRA agent or you're with another friend, a low vision friend, you grab an arm, you're just moving about, you don't interact with the sighted world as much. I know there's a lot of people who will say there is no blind culture. They'll still stand against that. Huh. And yet I believe today there definitely is.
One of the ways that my partner's blind as well, and one of the examples that I think of around blind culture is words that your screen reader always pronounces wrong. So that when Jason and I talk, we never say quinoa, we say quinoa. And we don't even laugh at it anymore, because Jaws just cannot say quinoa. It says quinoa. And that's become how we say it. Oh, are we out of quinoa? We don't even laugh at it anymore. And so there's a whole language around that of just things that we all understand that screen readers, always mangle. And to the point where they become not even funny. It's just part of our day to day.
I was giving an award to a student, and I had done his reports for 9 months straight. And so my Jaws says his name a certain way. And when I announced him, I said it exactly how Jaws says it. And everyone laughed.
Oh,
now,
no.
Not the sighted people. They didn't laugh. All the blind people laughed because they know what I did. I said it Jaws voice.
Yes.
And I paused and I said, I corrected it. But it was funny. But that was culture. All the blind people knew exactly where that derived from. So that was cool.
Yes, exactly.
Christine, how do you get involved in all this in Toronto, all this social awareness of audio description?
It was being in the right place at the right time and saying yes to things. So a few years ago, 5 years ago, I guess, I had been a massage therapist for 20 years, which is a very conventional path for a blind person. And I'd been happy doing it, but I wanted to change a pace. And our local CNIB, the Canadian National Institute for the Blind, was having these internship, returnship kind of things. And they were paid opportunities, but very minimum wage. But it was a chance to do something different. So I took a kind of a receptionist job, really, receptionist office manager at one of the local hubs for CNIB. And once I was in there, I just started looking around thinking, I'd like us to be doing this, and I'd like us to be doing that. Like, this is what I think is interesting. So one of the things that I wanted to do was get to know audio describers, because I wanted to get behind the scenes there. I wanted to know how audio description gets produced, because of course it's been life-changing for those of us who grew up without it and now have it. So one of the things I started doing was, with the backing of an agency, I started hosting events with audio describers and getting to know them. And once you kind of hook up with audio describers, it kind of gets you into the arts world in a broader sense, because of course they're working with TV companies and movie companies and theaters and places that are producing the arts. And so it's been a combination of being in the right place at the right time, and I just keep saying yes to things and showing up. And sometimes it might be something that doesn't involve being paid, but you just know you're going to meet some great people and make connections. And I gotta say, I'm hesitant to say this because I don't want it to sound crass, but the pandemic has been really good for my career. And I'm sure I'm not the only one that's true for, listening parties and virtual events, and just the changing social landscape that has made accessibility and inclusion more of a priority have been really helpful in my work. But it all kind of started with just my insatiable curiosity about, how does audio description get made, and who wants to be an audio describer? What's the career path that leads you there? And my curiosity about those things, and luckily getting to know people in the industry, and then kind of having some initiative of my own, but getting people just started asking me to do this thing or that thing. And it's taken me in directions that I'd never imagined. Like, I never thought of interviewing David Suzuki. See, I can't even say it with a straight face. It's so absurd to me still. So the interview has not been released yet, but it's still just bubbling away in my consciousness as this incredible thing that happened, as a long line of being in the right place at the right time, saying yes to things, and it led to just this crazy thing that happened that I never anticipated.
Well, as for being in the right place at the right time, what place should people be in if they want to catch the Luminato Festival?
Yeah. So the website, which also, again, will appear in your show notes, it's luminatofestival.com. And so under there's an accessibility hub, and there you will find many points of access, but one of them is Radio Lumi, Lumi, and that's where there's links. It's a easy player link thing for starting on June 9th. So there's so many great things coming up. There's a play that David Suzuki and his partner are talking about the environmental movement. There's conversations between David Suzuki and Ed Bertinski. There's an incredible musical production called The Cave. There's an installation called Black Ark that looks at some of the history of slave ships. There's a beloved, a tribute to Toni Morrison, which is a discussion about Black women writers, and on and on and on. There's an installation about water. There's so many things, and many of them will be covered on Radio Lumi. So luminatofestival.com, and it's not local to Toronto. The Radio Lumi experience can be loved and experienced by everyone. It's full of audio description, great interviews, lively conversations. It's a grab bag of amazing content.
And that's starting in June?
June 9th through June 19th.
That's awesome. And they can find Talk Description to Me wherever they listen to the podcast, right?
Yeah, we release each Saturday morning. Yeah, it's called Talk Description to Me. The website is talkdescriptiontome.com if you want to go through and cherry pick episodes. We've done something very fun. We did a 3-parter on virtual reality. So one of JJ's kids got an Oculus, and JJ slaps it on and goes crazy in his living room describing stuff in VR.
Oh, wow.
So yeah, anywhere you get your podcasts, talkdescriptiontome.com. Yeah, we cover current events and stuff in the world, just the world around us. You never run out of things to describe, and JJ and I have great fun. We really enjoy each other's company, so it's a great conversational podcast.
Yeah, it's really neat when it's really relevant, like here in Minneapolis, when the riots all were happening, and then January 6th when that happened, and all the other things, and now Star Wars. So it's really, sometimes it's to the moment, fireworks and stuff or whatever. It's really good stuff. And it gives you that description that if you hear about it on the news, but then when you get in and you and JJ start going at it, it's like, wow, it's almost like you're right in the picture. You're part of the paint.
Well, my latest mantra in the show is, I don't know what I don't know. And I seem to just keep defaulting to that lately in our episodes. Like, okay, I don't know what I don't know. What do I need to know here? And I really do feel that it's filling a gap that we didn't know was there. And the news, there's talking heads. You figure, oh, well, they're talking, so we must be getting everything. But the news landscape changes, and, people are looking at images on Facebook and Instagram, and there's always images behind the newsreader as well. So it's not really something that ever seemed like a gap until we started to fill it. Yeah, the listeners really seem to appreciate it. And I just feel so grateful to get to talk to JJ every week and ask all my endless questions. And it's definitely added to my cultural literacy, so that when people make jokes about Bernie Sanders' gloves or something, his mittens or whatever, I know what they're talking about. And so there's a ton of cultural literacy that comes just from knowing, what does Donald Trump look like? Or, what do people do at 4th of July picnics or Canada Day picnics, or what does a protest look like? There's so much cultural information that is visual. Yeah, we love to do the work, and we love the listener feedback on it. People seem to really appreciate it.
Well, it's really good stuff. I see it every time when it pops into my feed on my podcast app right on my phone, and there it is. And so, good stuff. Christine, thank you so much for coming on The Blind Abilities and sharing everything. We'll get everything in the show notes so people can go check out from black holes to arts and just about everything.
Just about everything.
I like that you're really tapping into the arts and the STEMs. It's that area that so many people didn't have an opportunity for. So good for you.
Yeah. Yay. Thanks so much, Jeff.
It's always a great time to have Christine on the Blind Abilities podcast. Be sure to go check out her podcast, Talk Description to Me, with JJ Hunt and Christine. Such a great podcast with audio description on anything in the world, the universe, and more. Be sure to check out the links for the Chandra X-Ray Observatory, the podcast, Talk Description to Me, wherever you listen to podcasts, and talkdescriptiontome.com, and the Luminato Festival Toronto. A big shout out to Chichow for his beautiful music. You can follow Chichow on Twitter at LChichow. And for more podcasts with the blindness perspective, check us out on the web at www.blindabilities.com, on Twitter at blindabilities, and download the free Blind Abilities app from the App Store and Google Play Store. That's 2 words, Blind Abilities. And if you want to leave some feedback, give us some suggestions, give us a call at 612-367-6093. We'd love to hear from you. And from all of us here at Blind Abilities, through these challenging times, stay well, stay informed, and stay strong. I want to thank you for listening, and until next time, bye-bye.
When we share
what we see
through each other's eyes, we can then begin to bridge the gap between
the limited expectations and the realities
of blind abilities.
The realities of blind abilities.